Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Carl adjusting the hem of his floral dress. His calloused hands, more accustomed to wielding power tools than delicate fabrics, fumbled with the zipper. A sigh escaped his lips as he surveyed his reflection, stubble carefully concealed beneath layers of foundation, eyebrows plucked into feminine arches, and lips painted a soft pink. "You've really done it this time, old boy," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. It had all started innocently enough. Carl and Marla's relationship had always been fueled by a competitive streak, each constantly trying to outdo the other in various aspects of life. From who could make the best lasagna to who could parallel park in the tightest spot, their marriage was a never-ending series of challenges and contests. But this latest competition, dreamed up by Marla's meddlesome mother, Eleanor, had taken things to an entirely new level. A best wife contest of all things? Carl had scoffed at first, certain that Marla would dominate in such a traditionally feminine arena. But then a spark of defiance ignited within him. Why shouldn't he compete? He was just as capable as Marla in household tasks, perhaps even more so. "I'll show them all," he had declared, much to Marla's amusement and Eleanor's barely concealed disdain. Now, weeks into the contest, Carl was beginning to question his decision. The competition had started innocently enough, cooking challenges, laundry folding races, and the like. But as the days wore on, the tasks became increasingly demanding and, well, feminine. Carl's mind wandered back to the previous week's challenge, a cutthroat bake-off judged by Eleanor's bridge club. He had spent hours perfecting his red velvet cupcakes, complete with delicate cream cheese frosting rosettes. The memory of piping those tiny flowers onto each cake, his large hands cramping from the unfamiliar motions, still made him wince. But he had triumphed. The looks of shock on the faces of Eleanor's cronies when they bit into his moist, flavorful creations had been worth every moment of frustration. Marla had been less than pleased, her own lemon bars receiving only polite nods from the judges. A knock at the bedroom door jolted Carl back to the present. "You almost ready in there, honey?" Marla's voice dripped with saccharine sweetness. "Mom's waiting downstairs." Carl gritted his teeth. "Just a minute, dear," he called back, pitching his voice higher than usual. He gave himself one last critical look in the mirror, smoothing down the front of his dress and adjusting the padded bra he wore underneath. The things he did for victory. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Marla stood there, looking effortlessly feminine in a simple sundress and sandals. Her eyebrows shot up as she took in Carl's appearance. "Well, well," she said, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "Don't you look pretty?" Carl resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Thank you, darling," he replied, matching her tone. "Shall we?" They descended the stairs together, Carl taking careful steps in his low heels. Eleanor waited in the living room, her shrewd eyes narrowing as she assessed Carl's outfit. "Well, isn't this a sight?" she remarked, her tone as dry as the martini she clutched in her bejeweled hand. "Carl, dear, you've certainly embraced the spirit of the competition." Carl forced a smile. "Thank you, Eleanor. I believe in giving my all to any challenge I undertake." Eleanor's lips thinned. "Indeed? Well, let's get on with today's task, shall we?" She produced a list from her purse, clearing her throat dramatically before reading aloud. "Today's challenge is all about grace and poise. You'll be attending my garden club's annual tea party. Points will be awarded for etiquette, conversation skills, and overall ladylike behavior." Carl's stomach dropped. A tea party? With Eleanor's gaggle of gossiping friends? He glanced at Marla, who looked equally unenthused. "Oh, and one more thing," Eleanor added, her eyes glinting with mischief. "You'll each be required to give a brief presentation on flower arranging. I hope you've been studying." Carl's mind raced. Flower arranging? He knew next to nothing about the subject. But he'd be damned if he'd let that stop him now. Sounds delightful, he lied through his teeth. When do we leave? The drive to the garden club was tense, with Marla and Carl both lost in thought, mentally preparing for the afternoon ahead. Carl's mind whirled with half-remembered facts about flower stems and color coordination he'd frantically Googled the night before. As they pulled up to the quaint Victorian house that housed the garden club, Carl's palms began to sweat. He wiped them surreptitiously on his dress, taking care not to smudge his freshly painted nails. "Ready, darling?" Marla asked, her voice sickly sweet. Carl nodded, steeling himself. "Born ready." They made their way up the path, the sound of genteel laughter and clinking china growing louder as they approached. Eleanor led the way, pushing open the ornate front door without knocking. The scene that greeted them was like something out of a period drama. Elderly women in pastel suits and elaborate hats sat around tables laden with delicate teacups and tiered platters of finger sandwiches and petit fours. The air was thick with the scent of roses and Earl Grey. All conversation ceased as the trio entered, every pair of eyes turning to fix on Carl. He felt his cheeks flush beneath his makeup, but forced himself to stand tall, channeling every ounce of grace he could muster. "Ladies," Eleanor announced, her voice carrying across the hushed room.
"You remember my daughter, Marla, of course. And this is Carl."
A murmur rippled through the assembled women, some tittering behind gloved hands, others openly staring. Carl plastered on his most winning smile.
"How lovely to meet you all,"
he said, his voice higher than usual. "What a beautiful gathering." Slowly, the chatter resumed, though Carl could feel curious glances still being cast his way. He and Marla were directed to separate tables, a move Carl suspected was Eleanor's doing to prevent them from comparing notes or assisting each other. Carl found himself seated between a woman with steel gray hair piled atop her head like a beehive and another whose floral perfume was so strong it made his eyes water. He delicately arranged his skirt as he sat, remembering at the last second to cross his ankles instead of his legs. "Well, aren't you a unique addition to our little soirée?" the gray-haired woman remarked, eyeing Carl over the rim of her teacup. Carl summoned his most charming smile. "Thank you so much for having me. I must say your hat is absolutely stunning. Is that a hand-painted silk flower?" The woman's eyebrows shot up, clearly surprised by Carl's knowledge.
"Why, yes, it is. How observant of you."
Carl silently thanked the hours he'd spent poring over fashion magazines in preparation for this day. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. You know, I've always been fascinated by the art of millinery." As he launched into a discussion about hat-making techniques, Carl could see the women at his table warming to him. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Marla at her own table, her smile looking a bit strained as she nodded along to whatever conversation was happening there. The afternoon progressed in a whirl of tea, tiny sandwiches, and increasingly arcane discussions about gardening techniques. Carl found himself drawing on reserves of charm and knowledge he didn't know he possessed, peppering his conversation with tidbits about rose cultivation and the language of flowers. Finally, it was time for the presentations on flower arranging. Marla went first, her arrangement a perfectly acceptable but somewhat uninspired collection of roses and baby's breath. She spoke competently about balance and color theory, earning polite applause from the assembled ladies. Then it was Carl's turn. He approached the front of the room, his heart pounding beneath his padded bra. This was it, the moment that could make or break his performance at the tea party.
"Ladies,"
he began, his voice clear and confident. "Today I'd like to demonstrate a technique that combines traditional Japanese ikebana with modern Western sensibilities." A ripple of interest passed through the room. Carl took a deep breath and began to work, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he selected stems and positioned them in the vase. As he worked, he spoke about the principles of ikebana, the importance of negative space, the representation of heaven, earth, and humanity in the arrangement. He wove in anecdotes about famous ikebana masters and the historical significance of certain flowers in Japanese culture. By the time he placed the final stem, a single perfect orchid, the room was silent, all eyes fixed on his creation. It was an unconventional arrangement, to be sure, but undeniably striking in its simplicity and balance. And there you have it, Carl concluded, stepping back from his work. A fusion of East and West, tradition and modernity, much like the diverse and beautiful gathering we have here today. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, applause began to build. Soon, the whole room was clapping enthusiastically, several women even rising to their feet for a standing ovation. Carl caught Marla's eye across the room. Her expression was a mix of shock, admiration, and just a hint of resentment. Eleanor, standing near the back, looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. As the tea party wound down and goodbyes were exchanged, Carl found himself surrounded by a cluster of ladies, all clamoring to compliment his arrangement and ask for gardening advice. He fielded their questions with grace, making mental notes to research their more obscure inquiries later. Finally, they were in the car heading home. The silence between Carl and Marla was thick with unspoken words. "Well," Marla said at last, her voice tight, "you certainly made an impression." Carl allowed himself a small smile. "I suppose I did. Where did you learn all that? About ikebana and millinery and everything else?" Carl shrugged, wincing slightly as the motion made his shapewear dig into his ribs. "Oh, here and there. A little research goes a long way." Marla's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "This isn't over, There are still more challenges to come." "I wouldn't expect anything less, dear," Carl replied, his voice sweet, but his eyes glinting with determination. As they pulled into their driveway, Carl couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. He'd more than held his own at the tea party, possibly even pulling ahead in the overall competition. But as he gingerly climbed out of the car, his feet aching in their confining heels, a small voice in the back of his mind wondered just how far he was willing to go to win this contest. The next morning, Carl awoke to the sound of Marla's alarm blaring. He groaned, rolling over to bury his face in the pillow. His muscles ached from maintaining perfect posture throughout yesterday's tea party, and the faint scent of nail polish remover still clung to his fingers. "Rise and shine, darling," Marla chirped, her voice far too cheerful for the early hour. "We've got a big day ahead of us." Carl cracked open an eye, regarding his wife suspiciously. "What do you mean, big day? It's Saturday?" Marla's smile was all teeth as she perched on the edge of the bed. "Oh, didn't Mother tell you? Today's challenge is all about maintaining a beautiful home. We're hosting a dinner party tonight for my boss and his wife." Carl sat bolt upright, sleep forgotten. "What? But I have to work today." "I took the liberty of calling in for you," Marla said, her eyes glinting. "Told them you weren't feeling well. After all, a good wife's priority should be the home, shouldn't it?" Carl's mind raced. He had an important presentation on Monday, one he'd been planning to fine-tune today, but he couldn't back down from the challenge, not when he'd come so far. "Fine," he gritted out. "What time are they coming?" 7 o'clock sharp, Marla replied, already heading for the door. "Oh, and Carl? Don't forget, a good hostess always dresses to impress." With that parting shot, she was gone, leaving Carl to contemplate the daunting task ahead. He dragged himself out of bed, wincing at his reflection in the mirror. The remnants of yesterday's makeup left dark smudges under his eyes, and his chest hair was starting to peek through the neckline of his nightgown. "Pull yourself together, man," he muttered, splashing cold water on his face. "It's just one dinner party. How hard can it be?" As it turned out, very hard indeed. The day passed in a whirlwind of cleaning, cooking, and frantic trips to the store for forgotten ingredients and table decorations. Carl found himself longing for the relative simplicity of his day job as he wrestled with the complexities of creating a gourmet 4-course meal. By 6:30, the house was spotless, the table was set with their best china, and a mouth-watering aroma wafted from the kitchen. Carl stood in front of the bedroom mirror once again, this time adjusting the fit of a sleek black cocktail dress. He'd opted for a more subtle makeup look tonight, with just a hint of smoky eyeshadow and a deep red lipstick. "You can do this," he told his reflection, squaring his shoulders. "Just channel your inner Donna Reed." The doorbell chimed at precisely 7 o'clock. Carl took a deep breath and plastered on his most welcoming smile as he went to answer it. "Welcome," he greeted Marla's boss, Richard, and his wife, Patricia. "We're so delighted you could join us this evening." Richard's eyebrows shot up as he took in Carl's appearance, but to his credit, he recovered quickly. "Carl, you're looking different. How nice of you and Marla to have us over." Patricia, meanwhile, was eyeing Carl's outfit with undisguised interest. My, Carl, that dress is simply stunning." "Valentino, isn't it?" Carl nodded, silently thanking the fashion gods for his last-minute splurge at the designer consignment store.
"Good eye, Patricia. Please come in. Can I offer you a drink?"
As he ushered them into the living room, Carl caught sight of Marla descending the stairs. She wore a fitted red dress that hugged her curves, her hair and makeup flawless. Their eyes met, and Carl saw the challenge there. Game on. The evening progressed in a haze of polite conversation and perfectly timed courses. Carl flitted between the kitchen and the dining room, keeping glasses filled and serving dishes replenished. He found himself drawing on reserves of charm and hostess skills he didn't know he possessed, regaling their guests with anecdotes and ensuring the conversation never lagged. As he served the main course, a perfectly roasted duck with an orange glaze, Carl couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. He'd pulled this off despite the short notice and his complete lack of experience in haute cuisine. Marla, he noted with satisfaction, looked slightly put out by the lavish praise Richard and Patricia were heaping on the food. "Carl, this is simply divine," Patricia gushed, taking another bite of duck. "You simply must give me the recipe." "Oh, it's just a little something I threw together," Carl demurred, his cheeks flushing with pleasure beneath his foundation. "The secret is in the marinade, you know." As the evening wore on, Carl found himself relaxing into his role as the perfect hostess. He topped up wine glasses with a flourish, laughed at Richard's increasingly off-color jokes, and even managed to bond with Patricia over a shared love of vintage brooches. Finally, as the clock struck 11, Richard and Patricia made their goodbyes, both effusive in their praise of the evening. "Carl, Marla, thank you for a wonderful night," Richard said, clapping Carl on the shoulder.
"You know, we should do this more often. In fact," he paused, a considering look in his eye. "Carl, how would you like to head up our new client relations department? I think you'd be perfect for it. You clearly have a knack for entertaining and making people feel at ease."
Carl blinked, taken aback.
Well, that's very kind of you to offer, Richard. I'd certainly be interested in discussing it further." "Excellent," Richard beamed. "We'll talk more on Monday. Marla, you've got some competition in the office now, eh?"
Marla's smile was brittle as she bid the couple goodbye. As soon as the door closed behind them, she rounded on Carl. "What was that?" she hissed, her eyes flashing. "You're supposed to be playing at being a housewife, not angling for a promotion." Carl raised an eyebrow, feeling a surge of defiance. "I was just being a good host, dear. Isn't that what this challenge is all about?" Marla opened her mouth to retort, but was cut off by the chime of her phone. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "It's Mother," she said, her voice clipped. "She wants to see us both, now." The drive to Eleanor's house was tense, with neither Carl nor Marla speaking. Carl's mind whirled with the events of the evening. Had he gone too far? Was this whole competition spiraling out of control? Eleanor answered the door in a silk robe, a martini already in hand despite the late hour. "Well, well," she said, eyeing them both critically. "Come in, you two. We need to talk." They followed her into the living room, perching awkwardly on the edge of an overstuffed sofa. Eleanor settled into her favorite armchair, fixing them with a steely gaze. "I've been hearing some interesting things about tonight's dinner party," she began, swirling her martini. "It seems our Carl here made quite an impression." Marla shifted uncomfortably. "Mother, I can explain." Eleanor held up a hand, silencing her.
No need, dear. I think it's clear what's happening here. She turned her gaze to Carl. You're taking this competition very seriously, aren't you, Carl? Carl nodded, unsure where this was going. I always give my all to any challenge I undertake, Eleanor. You know that. A slow smile spread across Eleanor's face. Indeed, you do. Which is why I've decided to up the ante. Carl and Marla exchanged wary glances. What do you mean? Marla asked. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes glinting. The final challenge. The ultimate test of who can be the best wife. For the next month, you'll both live as full-time homemakers. No work, no outside commitments. Just pure, unadulterated domesticity. Carl felt his stomach drop. A month? But his job, his projects, his entire life outside of this crazy competition. And to make things interesting, Eleanor continued, the winner will receive a substantial cash prize, let's say $50,000. The room fell silent. Carl's mind raced. $50,000 could pay off their mortgage, fund the home renovations they'd been putting off for years. But at what cost? You can't be serious, Marla sputtered. Mother, this is insane. We have jobs, responsibilities. All of which can be put on hold for a month, Eleanor interrupted smoothly. Unless, of course, you're not up to the challenge. The gauntlet had been thrown down. Carl looked at Marla, saw the fierce determination in her eyes that mirrored his own. They were in too deep to back out now. I'm in, Carl said, his voice firm. Marla nodded, her jaw set. Me too. Eleanor's smile was triumphant. Excellent. The challenge begins tomorrow. May the best wife win. As they drove home in silence, Carl's mind whirled with the implications of what they'd just agreed to. A month of full-time homemaking. A month of maintaining his feminine facade 24/7. A month of competing against Marla in every aspect of domestic life. What had he gotten himself into? The next morning dawned bright and early, the sun's rays peeking through the curtains to rouse Carl from a fitful sleep. He blinked groggily, reaching for his phone out of habit to check his work emails. Then reality crashed over him like a cold wave. No work, no emails, nothing but the challenge ahead. With a groan, he hauled himself out of bed, wincing at the unfamiliar sensation of silky pajamas against his skin. He'd have to get used to this, he realized. This was his life now, at least for the next month. In the bathroom, he stared at his reflection in the mirror. Stubble was already beginning to darken his jaw, and his chest hair was visible above the neckline of his nightgown. With a sigh, he reached for his razor and the bottle of hair removal cream he'd purchased in preparation for this day. An hour later, freshly shaved and depilated, Carl stood in front of his closet, surveying his options. The rack was now filled with dresses, skirts, and blouses, a far cry from his usual array of suits and casual wear. He selected a floral sundress and a pair of low heels, steeling himself for the day ahead. Downstairs, he found Marla already in the kitchen, looking annoyingly put together in a gingham dress and frilly apron. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air. Good morning, darling, Marla chirped, her voice syrupy sweet. I hope you slept well. I've made breakfast. Carl forced a smile. How thoughtful of you, dear. It smells wonderful. They ate in silence, the only sound the clink of cutlery against plates and the ticking of the kitchen clock. Carl's mind raced, trying to plan out his day. What would Eleanor consider proper homemaker activities? Cleaning, cooking, gardening. As if reading his thoughts, Marla spoke up. Mother called earlier. She's given us our first task for the day. Carl raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what might that be? Marla's smile was all teeth. Spring cleaning, the entire house, top to bottom. She'll be inspecting this evening.
Carl's heart sank. The thought of spending hours scrubbing and dusting in his new outfit was less than appealing, but he couldn't let Marla see his dismay.
Wonderful,
he said, matching her tone.
I'll start upstairs, shall I?
The day passed in a blur of cleaning products and aching muscles. Carl found himself contorting into positions he never thought possible as he scrubbed baseboards, dusted ceiling fans, and vacuumed under furniture that hadn't been moved in years. By mid-afternoon, his perfectly coiffed hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his manicured nails were chipped from scrubbing. But he pressed on, determined not to let Marla outdo him. As he was polishing the hallway mirror for what felt like the 100th time, the doorbell rang. Carl froze, suddenly acutely aware of his disheveled appearance. "I'll get it," Marla called from downstairs, her voice suspiciously chipper.
Carl heard the murmur of voices, then footsteps on the stairs. He turned to see Marla ascending, followed by his boss. "Carl, his boss, Mr. Thompson," exclaimed, his eyes widening as he took in Carl's appearance. I just came by to check on you. Marla said you weren't feeling well."
Carl felt his face flush beneath his makeup.
"Mr. Thompson, this isn't... I mean..."
Mr. Thompson held up a hand, looking deeply uncomfortable.
"No need to explain, Carl. What you do in your personal time is your business. I just wanted to make sure you'd be back for the presentation on Monday."
Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain that he wouldn't be back on Monday?
That he was locked into this ridiculous competition for a whole month? Marla, sensing his distress, smoothly interjected. "I'm afraid Carl's condition is more serious than we initially thought, Mr. Thompson. The doctors ordered complete rest for at least a month. Isn't that right, dear?"
Carl nodded mutely, unable to meet his boss's eyes.
Mr. Thompson's brow furrowed. "A month? But the Anderson account? Well, I suppose we'll have to make do. Take care of yourself, Carl. We'll be in touch."
As Mr. Thompson beat a hasty retreat, Carl rounded on Marla.
"What was that about? You told him I was sick?"
Marla shrugged, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth.
"Well, you can hardly go to work dressed like that, can you? Besides, we agreed to commit to this challenge fully. No outside distractions."
Carl felt a surge of panic. His job, his projects, his professional reputation, all potentially in jeopardy because of this insane competition. But before he could voice his concerns, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught their attention. "That'll be Mother," Marla said, smoothing down her dress.
"Ready for inspection?"
Carl straightened his back, lifting his chin defiantly. "Bring it on." Eleanor's inspection was, predictably, thorough and merciless. She ran white-gloved fingers along every surface, peered into every corner, and even checked behind the toilet tanks. Carl and Marla trailed behind her, holding their breath as she examined their handiwork. Finally, after what felt like hours, Eleanor turned to face them. Her expression was inscrutable as she removed her gloves with deliberate slowness. "Well," she said at last, "I must say I'm impressed. You've both done an admirable job. However..." Carl's heart sank. There was always a however with Eleanor. "There can only be one winner for today's task," she continued. "And I'm afraid, Marla dear, that your efforts in the guest bathroom were somewhat lacking." Marla's face fell while Carl felt a surge of triumph. He'd spent nearly an hour on that bathroom alone, scrubbing every tile until it gleamed. "Therefore," Eleanor announced, "today's winner is Carl. Congratulations, dear. You've proven yourself quite the domestic goddess." Carl beamed while Marla's expression darkened. Eleanor, seemingly oblivious to the tension, clapped her hands together. "Now then, who's ready for tomorrow's challenge? I hope you both know how to can preserves." As Eleanor swept out of the house, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the promise of more trials to come, Carl and Marla faced each other in the spotless foyer. "This isn't over," Marla hissed, her eyes flashing. "Not by a long shot." Carl met her gaze steadily.
I wouldn't have it any other way, dear.
As he watched Marla stalk off to the kitchen, Carl couldn't shake the feeling that this competition was spiraling out of control. But with his job potentially on the line and $50,000 at stake, he had no choice but to see it through to the bitter end. He just hoped he'd recognize himself when it was all over. The days blurred together in a whirlwind of domestic challenges and increasingly elaborate costumes. Carl found himself mastering skills he'd never imagined needing, from creating elaborate table settings to crafting homemade potpourri. Each day brought a new task, a new outfit, a new opportunity to prove himself the superior wife. But as the competition wore on, Carl began to notice changes in himself that went beyond the superficial. His hands, once calloused from working with tools, were now soft and smooth from constant use of moisturizer. His gait had changed to accommodate the near-constant wearing of heels. Even his voice had taken on a slightly higher pitch, the result of weeks of conscious modulation. It wasn't just physical changes, either. Carl found himself genuinely enjoying some aspects of his new role: the satisfaction of a perfectly executed soufflé, the pride in a beautifully arranged flower bed. He caught himself humming as he folded laundry, taking genuine pleasure in the crisp, clean scent of freshly ironed shirts. These realizations unsettled him. Was he losing himself in this charade? Or was he discovering a part of himself that had always been there, buried beneath layers of societal expectations? Marla, too, seemed to be struggling with the intensity of the competition. Carl often caught her staring off into space, a wistful expression on her face. Once, he overheard her on the phone with her office, trying to keep up with work matters in secret. The strain was beginning to show on both of them. As they entered the final week of the challenge, the tasks became even more demanding. Eleanor, it seemed, was determined to push them to their limits. "Today," she announced one morning, sweeping into their kitchen unannounced, "you'll be hosting a charity luncheon for the local garden club. 12 guests, 3 courses, and it all needs to be perfect. Oh, and you'll need to give a presentation on the latest trends in sustainable gardening." Carl and Marla exchanged panicked glances. They had less than 5 hours to prepare a gourmet meal, transform their home into a suitable venue, and become instant experts on eco-friendly gardening techniques. "Ready, set, go," Eleanor trilled, settling herself at the kitchen island with a mimosa to watch the chaos unfold. What followed was a frenzy of activity that would have put any reality TV cooking show to shame. Carl and Marla moved around each other in a complicated dance, chopping vegetables, setting tables, and frantically Googling gardening facts. By some miracle, they managed to pull it off. As the last guest departed, full of praise for the delicious meal and informative presentation, Carl and Marla collapsed onto the sofa, exhausted. "Well done, both of you," Eleanor said, a hint of genuine approval in her voice. "I must say you've both exceeded my expectations. But remember, there can only be one winner, and we still have one final challenge ahead." Carl and Marla groaned in unison. What more could Eleanor possibly have in store for them? "Don't look so glum," Eleanor chided. "This last task is simple, really. All you have to do is throw a dinner party for your colleagues, impress them with your homemaking skills, your charm, and of course your new personas." Carl felt his blood run cold. His colleagues, the same people he'd been working alongside for years, who knew him as a decidedly masculine, career-focused individual. "But," he began, his voice cracking slightly. I can't." "Can't what, dear?" Eleanor asked, her tone deceptively sweet.
Can't face your coworkers? Can't maintain this charade any longer? If that's the case, you're welcome to forfeit the competition. Of course, that would mean Marla wins by default." Carl glanced at Marla, saw the mixture of apprehension and determination in her eyes. He knew she was struggling just as much as he was, but neither of them was willing to back down, not when they'd come this far. "No," he said firmly, squaring his shoulders. "I can do it. We both can.
Eleanor's smile was triumphant. Excellent! The dinner party will be this Saturday. I suggest you start planning now. As Eleanor left, Carl and Marla sat in stunned silence. Finally, Marla spoke, her voice small and uncertain. Carl, are we taking this too far? Carl sighed, running a hand through his now shoulder-length hair. Extensions, of course, another concession to the competition.
Probably. But what choice do we have? We're in too deep to back out now.
Marla nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. May the best wife win, then? May the best wife win, Carl agreed, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.